not only is the elevator not working, but the sound system's not working, but I think, can you hear me? Yes. If you can hear me, you will be able to hear our presenter, Robert Lee, perfectly. So he told me to use my operatic voice. I'm not sure I'm in good voice yet this morning. Robert has been a godsend to Edenton and our preservation movements and everything. And Robert arrived here, where are you, Robert? Was it three years ago? Was it 3 years ago? Okay. And so he's made all the rounds. He's in charge of all the spectacular places you've been to. He's the executive director of the Edenton Historic Commission and Elizabeth Van Moore Foundation. He's leading the preservation efforts in North Carolina's first colonial capital and one of its most scenic coastal towns. He's a consultant to the Cupola House Association, and he is the reason that the woodwork got back to Edenton. So we owe him a huge debt of gratitude. Currently, he's spearheading the 3 projects: the restoration of Edenton's Kadish AME Zion Church. If you haven't been there, please avail yourselves of the time that you're there to run by there. It's just spectacular. It'll be open, he'll tell you when it'll be open. But he's coordinating, of course, the reinstallation of the original 18th century woodwork in the Cupola House. And he's guiding the transformation of the caves, which you all enjoyed last evening, one of the state's most remarkable historic landmarks, and into a dynamic, publicly accessible historic site. You all experienced that last night, and what a treasure it is to be able to have that space. We all of us in preservation work together hand in glove, including with the state historic sites as well. So it doesn't work if you don't do that. So those of you who are outside of the Edenton area, go back home and perpetuate the preservation. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Robert.
Thank you. I have to admit, it's a lot of fun to be able to talk to you this morning about a project that I'm enjoying so much. So this is not something that's a difficult labor for me. I think the Cupola House restoration project is not only critical to Edenton and Edenton's future, but it really is a project that's getting a lot of statewide attention and even national attention. In fact, the PowerPoint presentation that I'm going to share with you this morning, I was invited to go to New York City just earlier this week to give this talk to a preservation group in New York City, along with representatives of Drayton Hall in South Carolina and Boscobel, a great historic house on the Hudson River in New York. So I think that's a way of saying that what we're doing with the Cupola House is receiving national attention and being recognized as of the same magnitude of importance as places like Drayton Hall that have been nationally iconic and famous for a very long time. But the Cupola House really is the great residential architectural icon of Edenton since the 18th century. Now, Edenton, as you all know, Edenton is North Carolina's architectural gem. There's really no denying that. I mean, I was talking the other day with our friends from Edenton Socialite about how, in North Carolina, when you think of Winston-Salem, you think of tobacco. When you think of Charlotte, you think of banking. When you think of Raleigh, you think of state government. But when you think of Edenton, the word that comes to mind is history. And so, Edenton has all of North Carolina's best colonial church at St. Paul's, where as you walk through the gate, you're in the historic burying ground with important figures to the left and to the right. And as many of you know, if you come on Christmas or Easter, you're going to be able to enjoy communion from the original 1725 church silver. Where we're sitting right now in the 1767 courthouse, this is a building that was probably designed by John Hawkes, who was the British-born, British-trained architect who came to North Carolina with Governor William Tryon, and is best known for Tryon Palace. But Tryon Palace is gone. So this may be our best opportunity to understand John Hawk's architecture here in the North Carolina colonies. But then the other thing is the Cupola House itself. So in addition to having North Carolina's best colonial church, North Carolina's best colonial public building, Edenton has North Carolina's best colonial house. Designed and built for Francis Corbin in 1758, bought in 1777 by Dr. Samuel Dickinson, and then inhabited by his family until that fateful day in 1918 when the Brooklyn Museum knocked on the door and pressed a call on Miss Tilly Bond. Now, this is what the house looked like at that time. You know, the family had gone through the Revolutionary War, the Civil War. In the late 1800s, it was really two generations of unmarried women, sisters and their niece, Matilda Penelope. And then by 1918, Matilda Penelope Bond, known as Miss Tilly, was the last living member of the family to be occupying the house. And I think, you know, financial means of support weren't what they had been in previous generations. And so when the curators from the Brooklyn Museum showed up and were willing to press an offer for all of the house's great architectural woodwork, she had to accept the offer. But that's where you and your families come into the picture, because no sooner was the ink on that deal dry than the Cupola House Association was formed by Edentonians to save this iconic landmark. And they were able to push the Brooklyn Museum back to where the only thing they were able to take was the first floor woodwork. But they then had to stop at the staircase. And so the staircase, the original staircase, and all of the second floor woodwork was retained. Many of you have already asked, there is a surviving record in the Brooklyn Museum's archives that the antiques dealer who was the intermediary for the negotiation received a check for a little over $5,100. And how much of that trickled down to Miss Tilly, how little of that trickled down to Miss Tilly, we can only imagine. But so on a fateful day, all of the first floor woodwork from this house was loaded onto a train car and shipped to New York City for installation in the Brooklyn Museum. Now, the reason why the curators wanted it is because of the architecture, because of the design and the quality of the carving, and the fact that so many of the details of this house are directly taken from, inspired by London pattern books of the Baroque style of the early 18th century. For architectural historians, books like Vitruvius Britannicus and Palladio Londinensis, here you see plates from those pattern books, were really driving the design of the Cupola House, so that what the Brooklyn Museum curators were doing is they were scavenging up and down the East Coast. Their goal was to find architectural relics from all of the 13 original colonies in order to install them in a new exhibition that would focus on early American culture, architecture, and decorative arts. I do think it's interesting in terms of their goal of getting woodwork from each of the 13 colonies. There aren't too many times when the Valley of Humility gets to laugh at the two mountains of conceit, but in this case, it is true that the Cupola House architecture from northeastern North Carolina was so good, they passed on getting any woodwork from Virginia. Just saying. So really the woodwork was sort of an encyclopedia of colonial American design with direct British inspiration. So here you're looking at three images of the woodwork, the stair hall, the dining room, the parlor, as they were installed in the Brooklyn Museum, where they were on display for 100 years, and really did serve as a backdrop for the Brooklyn Museum's collections. But times change and audiences change, and I think it's certainly an understatement that Brooklyn, New York has changed from where it is now from the 1920s. So the Brooklyn Museum stepped back and reassessed what was the role of these period room interiors moving forward, and realized that they just weren't going to mean to them what they were not going to mean to them in the early 2000s what they had meant to them in the early 1900s. And the board of directors did something that I think is very bold and generous. They voted to officially gift all of the first floor woodwork back to the Cupola House Association as a gift if we would cover the cost of all of its dismantlement and shipment, which I think was a very fair deal. And so that's the process that began. And here's a photograph that the Brooklyn Museum took inside the dining room in 1918. You can see where they've actually gone in before dismantlement and labeled every single individual piece of it in preparation for reassembly. And here you can see where we've done the exact same thing last year in the very same room, where in preparation for dismantlement, every single piece had to be labeled in preparation for the reassembly process that will begin later this year. So a little bit tedious and admittedly destructive. So here you're looking at the dismantlement process beginning in Brooklyn. Now, they had installed the woodwork and simply used drywall instead of plaster. So all of that drywall was just busted up, thrown away, but all the woodwork was meticulously salvaged, saved, removed properly, and then crated and stored and prepared for shipment back. And so here you see the great china cupboard on the left, sitting on the Brooklyn Museum loading dock, ready for loading into this very truck, where, in early November of last year, just as a train car departed the train station bound from Edenton for Brooklyn, on that day, that truck was fully loaded and exited the loading dock of the Brooklyn Museum and made it down the interstate to Edenton, North Carolina. And here you're capturing the truck actually coming down Water Street with the Penelope Waterhouse in the background. And many of you yesterday were at the warehouse where the woodwork is now being stored in preparation for its reinstallation. The same is true inside the house. As many of you also know, from 1918 on, the Cupola House Association, one of its most important annual duties was to send the Brooklyn Museum a very polite Christmas card, inquiring about the status of the woodwork, hoping it was doing okay, wishing it a happy holiday. And oh, by the way, if you ever think if you've changed your mind, let us know. But David Warren in the 1960s got sort of the ultimate reply back that, thank you for the Christmas cards, we appreciate it, the woodwork appreciates it, but we're just not interested in letting this woodwork go. It's too important. But again, that was in the 60s. And Brooklyn of today is not Brooklyn of the 1960s either. So by 2023, their thought process was quite different. So in the 1960s, the Cupola House Association meticulously recreated the original woodwork that had been in Brooklyn. And I'll explain just how meticulous the Brooklyn's installation was in guiding what was created here. So once all the original woodwork was back, then came the equally destructive process of removing all of the 1960s reproduction woodwork. But out of those two phases of destruction, actually comes great creativity and creation and knowledge and discovery. So for instance, here you're looking at the dining room after all of the paneling has been removed. So we're able to see, as you have already noticed, all of the original interior framing, all of the original siding. We found evidence of original plaster that had fallen into the cracks. We're able to better understand exactly how the house was constructed in 1758. We're able to learn a lot about its history of very extensive repairs in the 1800s, and even see the marks of kind of the surgical removal that took place in 1918. And we're able to sort of go back into like the masonry of the dining room chimney and institute very necessary repairs, do updates to electrical systems, plumbing, security systems in preparation for the reinstallation of the original woodwork. That's the phase we've really just concluded. So interesting discoveries. How many of you people did say yesterday that they remember when the Cupola house was the library? So if you remember when the Cupola house was the library, you maybe remember this doorway that went from the 18th century parlor to the back room, I guess when all this was filled with books. That door survived. What happened is that when the woodwork got to Brooklyn, they eliminated that door. They did not they removed it, but when they installed it, they eliminated that doorway. So in the 1960s, when everything Brooklyn had done was being replicated here, that doorway was removed. Because we were copying exactly what they did. In the opening up process, what became clear is that that door frame is absolutely original to 1758. What we also discovered is that the doorway that had always been here from the stair hall into the pantry area, that this is not an original door. That doorway was added at some point in the 1800s. Now, for whatever reason, the Brooklyn Museum eliminated this door, kept that one. When all of this was copied in Edenton, this door was eliminated, this door was copied. But what we now know, thanks to the forensic paint analysis, is that what Brooklyn did was they moved this door into that location. And we now actually have this original door. It just came out of there, and it wasn't until we looked at the paint analysis and all the layers of paint on both sides that we realized, no, the 19th century door didn't have, the 19th century doorway didn't have an 18th century door. This was the 18th century door that was original. So that's a good example of the kinds of architectural discoveries we've been able to make in this process. So Susan, I really want to laud her work. She is a nationally, even internationally recognized expert. She had previously done the work on the second floor of the Cupola house, and she was very eager and excited to come back to work on the first floor. But, you know, to give you a sense of where she is in the world of paint analysis, she's had to squeeze her trips to Edenton into her trips to Beijing, where she has this other little project going on there called the Forbidden City with the Imperial Palace in Beijing. But she's now wrapping up the very tail end of those studies. In the end, there were 2 more doors we needed to look at to fully understand the circulation pattern and how that had changed. But one of the exciting discoveries was when she climbed up on a ladder to look at the ceiling medallion. And I think I mentioned this yesterday. You know, it had over the generations, it had been painted as if it were the ceiling. But the question came up, well, let's just test it. And the idea was that it was plaster. Well, actually, what we discovered is it's not plaster. It's actually carved wood. It's actually carved wood, probably by the same carver who did all the other architectural carving throughout the house. And when she looked at the paint evidence for the ceiling medallion, it originally, in 1758, was painted just like the woodwork in the stairwell. So it was made out of wood, it was painted to be wood. It wasn't until later that it started getting whitewashed over as if it were plaster. And then it finally just came to be assumed to be plaster. We've reached out to our architectural colleagues at Williamsburg and elsewhere. Nobody is familiar with carved wooden ceiling medallions. So that may be an Edenton thing. That may be an Edenton thing that we can be very proud of. This slide may be a little bit dark, but Andrew Owenby and his team working on the exterior, they've been using different colored zip ties to color code nail holes, segregating 18th century nails from 19th century nails, and then using red string to calculate the width of exterior siding, which we know was probably pretty extensively replaced in the 1800s. The whole house seems to have undergone very, very extensive modifications in the 1800s. So this kind of meticulous work using color-coded string and zip ties, sticking them into each individual nail hole, helps recreate the patterns over time of when siding was being nailed in the 18th century with 18th century nails, and when later siding with 19th century nail holes, which would have a different size and shape, were coming along and segregating that out. Now the reason is because the Cupola house turns out to have another very interesting feature. On the cupola itself, what you're looking at on the left is some of the original rusticated siding. Rusticated is a 25-cent word for wood that is carved and shaped and beveled to look like it's stone. So it's meant to look like it is rectangular blocks of stone, but it's actually long wooden boards carved to look that way. I think we're still coming to terms with just how extensively rusticated the Cupola house exterior was in 1758. But what is exciting is that the image on the top right, that's two rusticated boards that were actually found stuck in the corners of the attic. Still laying around probably since the early 19th century changes to the exterior siding. Those boards were pulled off, they were just thrown in the attic and lay there for over 100 years. We also see where rusticated boards were used in some early 19th century repairs on the house itself. But one of the discoveries in Brooklyn was when that destructive process began in the back room, and they pulled the back room mantle off. The back of it is actually constructed with original rusticated boards that had been planed down, but still in the grooves of where it's meant to look like stone was paint evidence matching the original exterior paint. Now, Susan was able to help us even more in looking at the paint on the front of the mantle. And that mantle has a particular pigment called chrome yellow. Chrome yellow was not used in domestic house painting in America until late 1820s, about 1830. So therefore, that is really telling us that late 1820s, 1830, rusticated siding is coming off, it's being reused, unused boards are being thrown in the attic, it's being used for repairs, it's being used to make this mantle from the back room, and then the mantle is getting painted a brand new spiffy color that had never existed before with this brand newly invented pigment called chrome yellow. So, I mean, even that kind of discovery really helps us understand how the house has evolved. Now, part of what's interesting about rusticated siding, and if you look at the Cupola house, imagine if the rusticated boards that survive on the cupola actually came all the way down the front, what that would look like. But rustication was very in vogue in very voguish places. In the 1750s in Newport, Rhode Island, there was one of the earliest colonial American architects was a man named Peter Harrison. He was involved with the Redwood Library up top, built about 1750. Also in the 1750s, the Vernon House, built in Newport. There are 2 or 3 other houses that have rusticated siding. So for whatever reason, what Francis Corbin was doing here in Edenton was absolutely in line with what Peter Harrison was designing and doing in Newport. And then that other mountain of conceit, there was one kind of slightly famous house there that got rusticated siding when a man named George Washington started working on repairs to his house at Mount Vernon. He converted the original beaded board siding into rustication. There's a house in Charleston that has a rusticated front facade. It's not built till about 1770. So it's very interesting. Lots to think about. What was going on in Edenton? What were the connections here that allowed the craftsmen, well, Francis Corbin as a patron and the craftsmen he was employing to be aware of what Peter Harrison was doing in Newport and what George Washington was doing in Mount Vernon, and replicating the same treatment. We also know that originally the Cupola house had a widow's walk. The cupola, the octagonal cupola, included a door that you could walk out. Tilly Bond records the fact that it was among the family stories that her grandmother and great-grandmother had both been able to use the widow's walk for entertaining friends. But during those extensive repairs of the 1800s, not only did all the rusticated siding go away, except for the cupola, and then get reused, but the widow's walk also disappeared. So, but it places the Cupola house in a very distinguished architectural company nationwide. So, a lot's happened since 1918. Your families united to create the Cupola House Association, and you saved the house. You prevented the Brooklyn Museum from taking anything other than the first floor woodwork, and you allowed the Cupola House to go on to become a public library and a museum. You saved the second floor woodwork, you saved the staircase, and you were brave enough and bold enough and smart enough to send those Christmas cards every single year to the Brooklyn Museum until it finally took hold and they said, you know, that woodwork really does need to go back home. It really does need to go back to Edenton where it can be reinstalled in the very same place where it was. That process will begin next month. It'll probably take about 6 months or so, but it's already been a very educational process. We think that will continue. We think there will continue to be more discoveries to share with you. And as many of you learned last night and this weekend, if you have forgotten, that is that Edenton and Edentonians love to entertain. And they love to entertain themselves and they love to entertain their guests. So when that happens, when the woodwork is complete, please come back. It'll be a great celebration. As many of you may know, the 4th of July is a big, happy occasion in Edenton where there's always a public reading of the Declaration of Independence in Courthouse Green just below. According to local legend, in 1776, after the Declaration of Independence was signed, when the first copy made it to Edenton, the public gathered below that window right there where your host for breakfast is sitting. And the window was raised and the Declaration of Independence was read to the public assembly. So the 4th of July is always a big time. By that time, we hope to have the woodwork project completed, and we hope you'll all come back for that as well. I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have before you have to go on your luncheon cruise. Yeah.
Are there any images or drawings of the widow's walk?
There are none. So I think it would, the earliest photos we have of the house seem to be from the late 1890s. Can you go back one? So in this photograph, the house already has a standing seam metal roof. You can go to earlier photos and the wooden shingle roof is is still in place. So it might be that the standing seam lower, if we need to look at the records, that might be one of the first things the Cupola Association did. Because I don't know that Ms. Bond would have done that before the sale. But the Widows Walk was gone long before the age of photography, and there are no sketches, but there is good physical evidence.
So there are no architectural drawings in the original building of the house?
No.
Would it be similar to the ones in New York, the Willis Walks, and the houses?
We think it was perhaps even finer than the ones Yes.
The Christmas card campaign was a great idea. Whose idea was it and when did it start?
I think we'd have to go back through the records, but David Warren, we do know that in the early '60s wrote a very serious letter that kind of said, "Okay, come on, people, come on," but they did turn it down. But I think the Cupola House did a great job of keeping a polite, happy relationship with the Brooklyn Museum that paid off, which can be a lesson to us all. Yes, ma'am.
So the 1960s woodwork is going where?
So I think the Cupola House Association is going to make a big, bold decision and that question came up in New York earlier this week, and I said, I think when that decision is made and is ripe for announcement, it'll happen. But I think there's a great desire to try to keep it here locally and to try to keep it publicly accessible and to try to use it as a real community asset.
So it's in the warehouse where we were yesterday?
Yes, yeah. On one side's all the original, and the other side's all the 1960s. Yes, Jessica.
There were some paint samples taped to various areas.
Upstairs.
Was it
I
upstairs?
think upstairs there are some of the paint samples of what Susan discovered with the upstairs.
So the upstairs where those are painted will be repainted.
Our
those
goal is
colors.
to try to repaint the entire house as 18th century steam once all the woodwork is reinstalled.
Do you know when that was taken?
I think it's taken right around 1918, maybe slightly after. I was online last night. There's a postcard farther up Broad Street looking back. It captures the back of the Cupola House, and it has the standing seam metal roof. The company, this was marketed by Mitchner's Pharmacy, but they did a lot of Edenton postcards for a very long period of time. They were working with a Chicago manufacturer, and so I was looking at the records of that company. They continued producing postcards into the 1920s, but the style of the calligraphy on the front and on the back of the cards changed over time. That might be the way to really narrow it down. I did find online that there was an early Edenton postcard that they could absolutely date to 1911 because that was the date on the note on the back written by Mrs. Strain.
So that was a little bit before I did my homework in the Cupola.
Sorry.
I said that was a little bit before I did my homework in the Cupola.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Sir.
When did the last resident move out? When did it?
1918.
That was.
Yeah. So the money she was paid will allow her to buy another residence.
Yeah.
Now, when she moved out, so the Brooklyn Museum, they even took the window sash. So when the Brooklyn Museum was done loading their truck, there were not even windows on the first floor. So the Cupola Association really had to come in and extensively work to reseal the house and create a new interior for the first floor. Yeah, Dylan?
Would you update everyone on the position of this preservation society in relationship to the other preservation society? In other words, this.
Well, 1918 is incredibly early. I have friends who work for a lot of those other organizations, so I don't want to get too far out in saying, man, we're older than you are. But But you have a lot to be proud of. You have a lot- with the founding date and with the starting date of 1918, you have a lot to be proud of. Chuck?
So Robert, I mean, all of this costs money, I'm sure, so I'm just curious as to how all this is funded and kind of what the role of private philanthropy is to advance the mission of the Cupola House and how that comes into play as this work is being done at the time.
Well, as you know, private philanthropy is the mother's milk of nonprofit operations. We are very lucky to be the beneficiary of a state grant that is funding that has fully funded the Woodwork project. As the Woodwork project is completed, I think there will be a lot of other very important goals for the Cupola House in the immediate and short-term future. So if anybody here is thinking about financial support for the Cupola House, I don't want to dissuade you in any way. Your money will be put to very, very, very good use. Sorry.
When y'all do the paint analysis, is there any way to tell how many layers of paint?
Oh yeah, okay, so when the sample is taken, it's then resin mounted and examined under a microscope. So you're really looking at every single layer down to the wood or the plaster, what's called the substrate, the original supporting material that was painted. So in many cases, we were looking at samples with 22 layers. 22 layers. Louise?
Robert, you might want to tell Susan Buck's presentation is on our website, on the YouTube channel.
Yeah.
And her entire PowerPoint is also on the website.
Yeah,
so that
yeah.
you can
So the
follow
Cupola website,
along.
she came several months ago and did a talk with all of her preliminary findings, which are all still correct. It's really, we've really just been pursuing some of the very small fine points. So, but that is on the website, so you can go onto the Cupola Association website and look at the presentation she gave several months ago. The final report should be in hand at some point in October.
So I remember Stephen Clinton dying to the library and going upstairs to a museum full of all kinds of
Yes.
artifacts. What happened to all that?
That would be a better question for, so the second floor, there was a period, with the 1960s Woodwork project came the desire to turn the Cupola House into sort of a biographical furnished house museum. So I think a lot of the artifacts that the Cupola Association had in exhibit at that time are still within the collections of the Cupola House Association, but just used, exhibited, or stored differently.
You couldn't go up the steps, that was
Many of those artifacts were returned to the people who donated them,
Oh, okay.
and a few had nobody to give them to.
Would that have been in the 60s?
It would be before the 60s.
Yeah. But the Cupola Association has actually a very important collection with some really, really important pieces of Edenton history. I mean, most importantly are the Barker family portraits. I mean, those are the best colonial portraits in all of North Carolina. By John Wollaston, who painted extensively from New York all the way through Virginia down to South Carolina. The Barker family is really about the only known example of this work in North Carolina. And so to have those three portraits in their gilt frames, that's incredibly important. And then there are other things from the 19th century and early 18th century that have come into the Cupola House Association collections over time that are incredibly important. Yes, ma'am.
I'm Bill's daughter, and he told me that his grandmother had a tea room there.
Yes, I think there was a tea room there.
To raise money for the association.
Yeah, I think there was both the library and a tea room and the museum. It covered a lot of ground.
It was part of taking small amounts to keep the library running.
Yes. Yes, ma'am.
So in 1918, when they took the woodwork out, the Cupola House Association redid the walls with what? Just plaster all the way? Did they?
So I haven't seen photographs of that. The records survive. I think it was the Fred Booth Construction Company that did the work, and those records survive. But I think there was no attempt to replicate the splendor of the 18th century. It was just turning it into a functional library space.
So it went straight into a library at that point, basically.
The Cupola Association published a great book with the preservation of the treasure.
Deliverance of a Treasure.
Deliverance of a Treasure.
By
which-
Marianne A. Coffey and Murphy Moss.
Yeah.
That tells the story of the association's formation.
Yeah, in great detail. So they worked with all of the association's archives to sort of document that 1918 process, on forward with all the decisions the association made, and how it evolved over time. So if you don't have a copy of that book, be on the lookout for it. Anybody else? Maybe one last question? Well, thank you very much.
I'm the membership chairman. I'm the one, if you heard loud prayers last night, that's me praying for the weather. I can tell you one thing though, I've been the chairman for 3 years now. We've had inclement weather for 3 years, and the good Lord has taken care of us for 3 years. I just saw a weather map. Tom Newbern calls it the Edenton vortex, and those of you who have lived in Edenton know that often the weather that's in Hereford is not in Edenton. And the weather patterns that we saw 45 minutes ago has 2 tracks, one going westward towards Raleigh, one going out towards the water. We're going to make a call at 2:30. We'll put it on our website. Our backup plan is St. Paul's Parish Hall. So the party will go on. To your point, is that the oldest, anyone who goes to Charleston and tours the historic homes there, they brag that in 1920 they formed the first historic preservation. We're 1918. I'm not saying who's earliest. In any event, so we'll keep you posted. We're praying that the weather will clear, but we do have a backup. The party will go on. So thank you very much.